Hello, dear colleagues. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for another event of the CERE Observatory. This is an international platform for dialogue, exchange, and mutual learning on education, skills, and labor market issues in emerging economies. My name is Vera Maltseva, and I'm one of the co-founders of the CERE Observatory and currently an associate professor and director of the Center for Skills Development in Vocational Education at the High School of Economics in Moscow. And it's a great pleasure to guide today's discussion. And today's session is the fourth seminar in our comparative TVET series. In the previous sessions, we explored vocational education and training systems in China, India, Russia, and now our focus shifts to South Africa, and later we'll close this first series with a seminar on Brazil. And together, these 5 cases allow us to somehow look more systematically at how TVET systems in large emerging economies develop, respond to skill needs, and confront both shared and country-specific challenges. And also, I would like to mention that based on our seminar series, we're preparing short trend letters with some infographics. And these 3 issues covering the previous seminars are already available on the CERE website, and you can access them using the QR codes you see on the screen. And we would be very happy if you visit the CERE website. We do our best to update it and to share news and materials there. Yeah. So today's seminar is fully devoted to TVET development in South Africa, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Stephanie Allais. Professor Allais is Researcher of Skills Development and Professor of Education at the Center for Research and Education Labor at the University of Wits. Also, Professor Allais is a visiting professor in the School of Education at the University of Glasgow. Professor Allais' work concentrates on skills development, vocational education, and political economy of education, with particular attention to how institutions, qualifications, frameworks, and policy reforms shape labor market outcomes. Professor Allais is an editor of our top journal in our field, the Journal of Vocational Education and Training, and on the editorial boards of the several top peer-reviewed journals. Journal of Education and Training, the Curriculum Journal, the International Journal of Training and Development, Social Inclusion, and the Journal of Continuing and Adult Education. Also, Professor Allais has extensive experience in both research and policy processes in South Africa. She served on many committees by appointment of ministers of education in South Africa, served as special advisor to the current Minister of Higher Education and Training, and has been involved in numerous policy processes. So Professor Allais' scholarship has been highly influential in debates of TVET and skill system. Stephanie, we are very happy to have you with us today. Before passing the floor to Stephanie, let me just briefly explain how we will work today. First, Stephanie will give us a presentation. After, we'll move to the 2 interactive sections as usual. First, a Q&A session, and then a round of comments, reflections, maybe some comparative insights. So, dear colleagues, we are very welcome to type your questions in the chat at any time, but I warmly encourage you to ask questions by voice for a richer and more engaging discussion. So I guess that's it with some technical issues. So Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Vera. And now let's see if I can share my screen. I'm not very technically competent. Is it working?
Perfect. Yeah.
Oh, good. Great. It's great to be here. And I think, thanks again, Vera and Maxim. It's a great initiative. And it's really nice to have this forum in which we can learn from each other, particularly with the BRICS focus, but also an international comparative focus. Just a quick update, Vera. I think your bio info is a little bit out of date. I was advisor to the previous minister, not the current one, although we are still working with the current one in other capacities at my research center. So as Vera said, we've had 3 really interesting seminars. And what I like about this particular network it's got a very strong focus on a kind of looking at the economy, looking at the labor force, looking at how VET interfaces with both. And I want to look a little bit at that in South Africa, but also try and lift some issues out of the South African experience, which I think apply to many countries, and particularly this idea of demand-led vocational education, which we all hear about all the time. And as Vera was saying, I've been working in the policy space for very many years, like over 30 years. And one of the things that I find so striking is that people who come into the VET policy space for the first time always come with the idea of, let's just find out what the employers need, and then it'll be simple. So what I want to talk about today is why that is really not simple. It's much harder than what people really hope for when they are trying to do VET reforms. And I want to do that by explaining some aspects of our very complicated system in South Africa. We call it TVET, which is the more common term in low and middle income countries. So I'm going to use that term, but it really means the same thing. So, just to kind of start off by saying, and I think this is very common, and this is really what brings us together as a research network. This kind of difficulty, this conundrum is very, we see it everywhere. We see it around the world, particularly in low and middle income countries, but also in wealthy countries. This idea that, we need technical skills. We need technical skills for changing economies, for development, for reducing inequality, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's this enormous focus on reforming vocational education, or TVET as we call it. And when we talk about TVET, we usually refer to, or VET, systems or programs that develop mid-level qualifications, mid-level skills for mid-level jobs. Now, of course, as soon as you start talking about levels, you get into conceptual quagmires. So I'm using it in very, very broad brushstroke terms. But usually what you see is some kind of vocational specialization from the senior years of secondary school to kind of undergraduate level, or below undergraduate level, but post-school education. And that's really what I'm focusing on. And I think what's interesting and perplexing, and really I think South Africa is the poster child for this problem, is that TVET remains weak, even though so much time and energy and resources is put into reforming it. And in fact, I'm going to argue that sometimes it's because of the reforms, the time and energy that we put into reforming it, that we actually end up making it weaker than it was, or making it really difficult for TVET institutions to function. Now, this is particularly despite a range of different reforms that have as their focus improve engagement with employers, make the qualifications more relevant, find out what the employers need, offer what the employers need, make the institutions only get money if they're doing what the employers say they need, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these ideas which are very dominant in the policy space. Yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But just to take a bit of a step back, so this is a very, very broad brushstroke. The international research literature says that actually building large-scale successful TVET systems is not something that most countries have done. Very few countries have done it. The only countries that have built really mass, in other words, that enroll the majority of the youth age cohort, is the German-speaking countries, which are referred to in the literature as the collective skill formation countries. Other countries do have successes, just not at the same kind of scale. We see some success in the Asian developmental states. We see some success in Latin American countries. And so I'm very excited to hear about Brazil, because the Brazilian model, I think, really, inspired the whole continent. Although, of course, things have changed a lot since then. And some of the factors that seem to underpin VET systems that are more successful are collective cooperation between industry and the state, and in some cases, workers or labor unions, and education providers over long periods of time. Or, in the absence of that, very strong state coordination in economies where the state is driving industrialization. Or industry-funded institutions training a population that didn't have the option of secondary school, which is what we saw earlier in the century in Latin America. Now, in all of this, we see this paradox of demand-led skills. In the countries where VET is very strong, employers are very much built into the system. But in many other countries, governments feel frustrated by employers. And this is very much the case in our country. So we have this very strange paradox whereby, on the one hand, we're saying employers know what they want, employers know what skills they need. If you leave it to employers, they'll do, they let them run the system. And on the other hand, governments are saying, wait, the employers are not coordinating, they're not giving leadership. And so what we see is, and again, South Africa has really developed very, very extensive institutions to do this. Governments come in and say, we're going to develop these institutions, which employers are going to lead. But almost never are these institutions spontaneously developed by employers. And so it leads to an uneasy kind of relationship and role and structural design, etc. And that's what I want to share with you a little bit about today in South Africa. And so a lot of policy focus is then on trying to encourage employers, trying to incentivize them, trying to constrain them, trying to force them to take this leadership role, which they actually don't often show much sign of wanting to take. So that's the kind of paradox that we're dealing with. Now, what we see around the world, particularly in low and middle income countries, although it really originated in the United Kingdom and Australia, is this is a package of TVET reform, which my colleague Simon McGrath and I have referred to as the global toolkit, because it comes as a ready-made toolkit. You just need to take these tools, apply them wherever you are, and then you'll get a relevant TVET system. Your providers will be responsive, your employers will be engaged, the qualifications will be of quality. It's all pre-designed for you. What's particularly fascinating for me about this global toolkit, we're actually busy writing a book about it, so we'll hopefully be able to share that with you all later this year, is that when you look at VET comparatively, and that's one of the reasons that I think this group is so nice to have an international group that's where we're really sharing, is that VET systems are so different from each other. They're much more different from each other than the rest of education and training systems are when you look across countries. And yet, we have this package, which is very much one size fits all. So it says, get employers involved in qualification design, get them to specify what are the tasks and involved in work, use that as the basis of developing qualifications, which usually goes under the name of competence-based training or competence-based qualifications, sometimes referred to as occupational standards, not to be confused with occupational standards in the German-speaking countries. Qualifications frameworks is a huge part of this toolkit. Then one of the things that governments have tried to do, and our government is no exception, is introduce so-called quality assurance systems. And I always say so-called because, when you use the phrase quality assurance, people think somehow this institution is assuring quality. But actually, I've yet to see any evidence that this is the case. Rather, it is institutions that are set up to do accreditation of institutions, in other words, to say which institutions are allowed to offer provision, and sometimes to check up on assessment. So now, along with that comes the idea that if you fund qualifications that employers have developed against tasks in workplaces and give providers only money for those qualifications and for the learners who want to enroll in those qualifications, you will have relevant provision because it will be demand-led. It's demand-led in terms of the content of work because the employers have specified the standards, and it's demand-led in terms of which programs are being funded because you're only funding programs where there is actually learner demand. Now, there's all sorts of ways in which this goes wrong, and I'll just be talking about some of them. I just wanted to point out one last bit of this. So, one of the key features of the original toolkit that was developed in the United Kingdom and Australia was that they were trying to privatize VET provision. What you see in most low and middle income countries is some degree of privatization, but also what we call managed autonomy. Or another way of putting this is kind of contractualizing the state. So it is a public provider, but it's funded almost as if it's a private provider. The funding flows only against the employer specified qualifications. It only flows against learner enrollments, etc. So it's not quite private, but you're still creating a market-based model inside the state. Okay, now let's get to South Africa. So just to remind you what we are talking about, we are a little country. Well, we're not that little geographically, but I think, whenever we deal with other BRICS countries, I feel quite like we really don't belong in this club because our numbers are really insignificant compared to all the other BRICS countries. So we're little population-wise, right at the bottom of Africa. So that's just a map of South Africa showing you the different provinces. And South Africa is, as I said, very small compared to the rest of you guys, population of just over 61 million. And I've got a couple of slides on this issue of unemployment, because I think it's the biggest, we have many crises. I don't know if we can talk about the biggest crisis, but one of the very, very serious crises confronting South Africa is unemployment. We have really unbelievably horrific unemployment figures. And so I've just given you a few different ways of talking about this. But if you think about it, a population of 61 million, just over 17 million of those people are employed. So the official definition of the labor force combines employed and unemployed. But when you have chronic long-term unemployment, most people don't look for jobs. And then they don't get defined, or many people don't get defined as unemployed because they're not actively seeking work. So recently they've started changing how we define these terms. The expanded labor force, which includes discouraged workers, is about 22.4 million. So, that shows you an unemployment rate of up to 45% when you look at the expanded definition, or 32 to 33% when you look at the official definition that excludes discouraged job seekers. So, I'm sure, countries around the world, I always, when I engage with colleagues and they say, yeah, we've got an unemployment crisis of 8% or whatever it is, I just wanted to really emphasize that this is a catastrophe for our society. And it's something that we have not made progress on improving. So I've just got a few different slides that give you these breakdowns in different ways, because there's lots of quibbles with data and terminology and what do we include inside the labor force. So these are some of the more recent figures. People can just refer to them. I also did put a link to the to the full set of slides from Statistics South Africa, where I got this from. And so recently they've started talking about labor underutilization instead of unemployment to reflect the total number of people in the potential labor force. And here we're talking about up to 44.5% of the potential labor force of healthy, able-bodied, working age people who are not gainfully employed and would want to be if the opportunity was there. So that's just showing you, again, over time, over the last year, using these different definitions, the official unemployment rate. And I'm sure you'll agree that, you know, even if we stick to the very narrow, rigid term, it's a social crisis to have 31.4% of your working age population unemployed, and an even more serious crisis when we're talking about 44.5% of the working age population. And just to really drive this home and make you realize like how serious this is, the proportions of young people are much higher. So these are the official rates, not the expanded rates. And young people 15 to 24 years are at 57% of them are unemployed, and 25 to 34 years, 39.2% are unemployed. And that's the tight definition of unemployment, not the expanded. This is the last labor statistic that I want to share with you. It's just quite interesting. It just gives you an overview of the percentage of, so it's a little bit outdated, but it hasn't changed dramatically. This is the third quarter of 2024, and it shows you the percentage of people and the numbers, the share of the labor force, and the percentage of that group that was unemployed. And you can see that the group with the highest unemployment rate is those who have enrolled for secondary but not completed it. Partly that's because there's many older people in the labor force that have already been in the labor force with lower levels of qualifications, and that's why they show as more employed, and partly also because of the effect of rural agricultural workers, although that's much less significant in South Africa than other African countries. And you can see that what's quite striking is that the percentage for people with tertiary qualifications is that's the group that are most likely to be employed in our labor force. Okay, now, if you're a policymaker and you're confronting this, one of the things that the policymakers are absolutely convinced by is that VET is going to solve this problem. If we just fix the skill system, people will get jobs and we will no longer have chronic unemployment. Maybe companies will be able to grow and expand if they have more skilled workers, and then they'll be able to hire more people. There's a lot of different ideas about how that causality might run. And, you know, one of the big critiques of it, obviously, is that, as I already said, old people are much more employed than young people, even though young people are much more educated than old people. Now, of course, you could say, and policymakers tend to say, well, that's because the education that they're getting is not relevant. And that brings us to these different ways in which our policy systems have tried to improve the so-called relevance of vocational education and put employers in the leading seat that they are quite unkeen to occupy. And one of the things that I would argue is one of the key insights from an analysis of the South African reforms over many years is that what we've tried to do, and I think this is really what the Global Toolkit does, but South Africa just offers such a stark example of it, is we create formal systems and institutions that mimic what we see in the strong VET systems without any of the underlying conditions, economic systems, actual, real, meaningful relationships, etc. So, it looks like we're doing something similar, but we're actually doing something very different, which is a kind of a formalized kind of mimicry without the underlying real relationships that give it meaningful substance. So I think that for me, anyway, I hope you will agree by the end of this session that thinking about the South African systems, the thing about South Africa is we tend to do things in very extreme ways. So when we adopted these systems, we did it, everywhere. When we developed sector skills councils, we didn't just develop them in 3 sectors of the economy like many countries are doing. We developed them in all sectors of the economy. We developed a qualifications framework, which was going to be competence-based, essentially. We called it outcomes-based for all qualifications at all levels. And so, of course, we have many problems with these systems, but I think what's useful about it is that it really does highlight the logic of these kinds of reforms and what their limits and weaknesses are. So that's what I'm going to be giving you a little bit of an overview of. Now, what I want to jump into next is just to give you a bit of a sense of what our VET system looks like. Because as I said earlier, VET systems look very different from country to country. So we have our formal VET provision system happens through what we call public TVET colleges, technical and vocational education colleges. We have 50 of them. But when I say 50, that's 50 kind of official institutional entities, but most of them have a lot of campuses. So there's about 364 campuses spread across rural and urban areas of the country. And what I don't want to go into today, because I think your eyes would start glazing over, but it's kind of important to understand the insanity of our system. So I'll touch on a few aspects of it, is that over the past 30 years, we've had a very complex set of qualification reform, which has impacted on these TVET colleges in very profound ways, partly because we've tried to change the curriculum, but the qualification models are linked to assessment systems that are quite different, funding models that are very different, and so on. And currently, these unfortunate institutions are offering a range of all of these different qualifications at the same time, although some of them are now being phased out. Another point to note about our TVET college system is, now I said right at the very beginning that normally when people talk about VET or TVET, they're talking about qualifications that are either kind of senior secondary level or 1 or 2 years post-schooling, certificates, diplomas, etc., below bachelor's degrees. We have a very strange kind of situation, let me put it like that, in our VET system, whereby in theory, that's how our system works. So according to the policy logic, according to the way the policy has been developed, according to the qualifications framework, most of our qualifications are senior secondary level qualifications. But people don't always just comply with the way policymakers design policies. So what you see is people vote with their feet. And what actually happens, the reality of our TVET colleges, is that they're mainly offering post-school qualifications to people who have completed senior secondary school. So there's not a lot of young people who leave school at the age of 15 and go into TVET, although that's what they're supposed to do according to the policy. In reality, what they do is they finish school, often with very weak educational attainments that are not strong enough to get them into a university, and then that's when they go and enroll in a TVET college. And it's something that gives policymakers a lot of anxiety because in theory, they are now still doing senior secondary level programs. So whether or not that's a problem, I don't know, is a separate issue which we could debate afterwards. But according to the logic of the qualifications framework, which has levels, they are doing a program at the same level as what they've already finished. Okay, so that's our TVET system, and it's small. It's small relative to our school system, and it's small relative to our university system. We have far more students enrolled in universities than we have in TVET colleges, which is also something that policymakers have been trying to change for many years. Okay, so these colleges, I just want you to, send some sympathy to them. They have been reformed for 30 years. Institutional reform, mergers, structures, governance reform, new qualifications, new curriculum models, new ways of hiring lecturers, moving lecturers from being hired at a provincial level, which is what most countries call a state level, to the national level, what you might call the federal level, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to go into the detail of those decades of reform, I've just put the reference to a paper there that came out in JVET last year, which gives an overview of this kind of reform process that has happened in our colleges. Just a little bit of history. So under apartheid, they were called technical colleges, and they mainly offered programs to white men. Some of them, there were some offerings open to some other race groups. Colleagues, unfortunately, it's very important in South Africa to always look at the structural history and the ways in which racism and designated racial groups were treated differently by the state, because it has a very long shadow into our present. So what these colleges were set up to do is offer the theoretical component of apprenticeship programs. So we have always had, like most countries do, an apprenticeship system. It's always been quite small, unlike those wonderful German-speaking countries that I mentioned at the beginning. The apartheid government originally set up these institutions to offer the apprentices who would be going into the workplaces for 9 months a year short 3-month courses in which they would get the theory component of that would match the apprenticeship that they were doing in the workplace. Now, the apprenticeship system started collapsing towards the end of apartheid. The apartheid state was introducing various reforms to the training system. Black people were allowed into the colleges in the early 90s and quite quickly became the majority. But what had happened by this time is that very few students were actually doing apprenticeships. Because why? Not because they didn't want to, not because the colleges didn't think it would be a great idea to work with industry and let people have workplace experience, but because there were no apprenticeship places. For a complex range of reasons, which I'm not going to go into here, but it had to do with the fact that apprentices had been hosted in state-owned industries under apartheid, which were quite sheltered and protected. And in the late apartheid days, they were corporatized and they started shedding apprenticeships. So now suddenly you have these poor colleges offering only theoretical programs. And everyone is very critical of them. Why are they offering these courses that are completely theoretical? Why is that? How can you offer vocational education with no practical component? They're outdated. They're not what employers are looking for. But they were set up to be that because they were set up to offer the theory for the apprentices. So now the new state has to figure out what to do with them. The first thing they do, we had 152 technical colleges. The first thing we do is merge them into 52. We then call them further education and training colleges. They were given more autonomy. They were supposed to hire lecturers, and all of this was part of making them responsive to industry. Okay, So we have these different qualification offerings. I'm going to actually not go into that in too much detail, other than to say that what they are supposed to be offering now, the new qualification system that is now being phased into our TVET colleges, just so that they can have a new reform, is that they are going to be offering what we call in South Africa, for obscure reasons related to policy consensus seeking, occupational qualifications, what most countries would call vocational qualifications. And the idea is that these qualifications will make they'll get employment from them because they're occupational. They're linked to designated occupations on our organizing framework for occupations. And I think this is one of the examples where I would say that what we're doing is mimicking the systems that we see in the strong VET systems without any underlying reality. So instead of occupational standards codifying the knowledge and expertise of occupations which exist in the labor force, which have an independent meaning, an occupational identity, maybe a license to practice, maybe an occupational body. We have developed these things. This is two examples from some research that we are doing at the moment in the food and beverage manufacturing sector. So these are two occupational certificates. And when you look at the content associated with these certificates, it's really quite fascinating because most of it is completely generic. There's no actual theoretical body of expertise. And when you go into workplaces and you ask them, are they hiring? These are not occupations that any of them recognize. So the idea that this will, saying that once it's an occupational qualification based on occupational standards developed from tasks in workplaces, it'll be relevant, it'll be preparing learners for the real world of work, just isn't, unfortunately, the case in many instances, not in all. Another challenge with this new system is that learners have to have a workplace secured in order to register, which, you might think as a policymaker is a great idea, because if they can't secure a training place in a workplace, maybe there's no demand for that qualification. But the unfortunate reality is that most workplaces don't want to take on learners. And so people then just can't enroll for qualification. So this is a very, very new reform. And we're still waiting to see what is going to happen and how they're going to manage it. But the point that I want to just kind of emphasize is that in our original qualifications framework, we very much use the competency-based model of that we borrowed from the Brits and the Australians, where you start from tasks in workplaces. Our new system is a little bit broader, but it still starts from this idea of if employers specify tasks, it makes the thing occupational. It makes it somehow rooted in the world of work. And actually, in the context where there are no shared understandings of occupations, of work and expertise, putting it on paper in a qualification doesn't create that shared understanding. And so the occupational qualifications in many cases don't relate to occupations in any meaningful sense. Now, into all of this comes, and I'm going to have to wrap up, so I'm going to try and, I'm trying to explain a lot of complex systems quickly. Institutions, which we call in South Africa the skills levy institutions, because they were created with a skills levy, which we introduced in 1996 in law, although the institutions have only really existed since the early 2000s. And this is very much along the lines of sector skills bodies that are there in many countries. As I said, in South Africa, we call them something different. We call them SETAs, Sector Education and Training Authorities. And we created them in all sectors of the economy. And the idea was very much that this would ensure industry engagement. This would ensure industry leadership. And there's one main way in which our systems are set up to get information from employers about what their skills needs are, which everyone is always telling us is the holy grail of VET. If we can just find out what it is that employers want, then we'll be offering the right VET. So we have a levy, which is levied on all employers, and they have to pay 1%. All employers who have a payroll of, I can't remember the dollar amount, but it's a very low threshold. So very, very small employers are exempted. But as long as you've got a turnover of more than a certain amount, you pay 1% of your payroll to the South African Tax Service. That money goes to one of these sector education and training authorities, and you can get some of it back if you submit a document which gives information on your skills needs, your skills gaps and vacancies, as well as the training that you've planned and the training that you've conducted. So we have this amazing mechanism to get insight from employers, which unfortunately, and I had some references on the previous slide, is not working very well for a whole range of reasons, partly linked to we're asking them for much too much information. And so they don't answer most of it, or they don't answer it, they don't take it very seriously. They just make it, they answer it to the extent that they can get their money back, but they're not really giving us useful information about their skills needs. Okay, so there's a number of problems with these organizations which were set up to create industry engagement and industry leadership. Partly it's these kind of rules and tools that I was mentioning, which they are forced to use. So it's not their choice. They are given a set of rules through which they have to gather information from employers, which are called the Workplace Skills Plan and annual training reports that I just mentioned. And then on the basis of that information, as well as other research that they do, they develop sectoral plans. And those sectoral plans are supposed to guide the money that they're going to put into training in their sector. But the ways in which that money is allocated is quite rigid. And it's very much based on people applying for grants. The CETAs all have the same design, governance structure, regardless of very, very different logics in industry. And this is really the point that I made at the beginning about creating formal institutions that kind of mimic relationships that aren't really there. And, if you don't develop structures organically from the logics of different kinds of industry, then you end up with structures that look the same, but they have very weak linkages with industry bodies. So, it brings us to this idea of the paradox of employer engagement, where everyone wants employers to lead. Employers don't want to lead. We create these institutions with the hope that when we've got these institutions, we will be gaining insight from employers and, hopefully also workers and labor unions, but we're not actually getting it. And the funding model that's associated with it, and this is very much comes from the British reform model, is based on this logic of just, if people apply for money and they can show you that they need it, you give them the money. But there's no theory of how do we build institutions that are actually going to offer these qualifications? What does it take to offer a vocational qualification? It's not an easy thing to do. And so it's almost like we're expecting these institutions, I think, I think the global toolkit, and it's not only in South Africa, that's why we call it the global toolkit, it kind of expects miracles of the weakest institutions in our education systems. It expects them to be highly entrepreneurial, highly, able to go out and sell their services, bid for grants. And they are dealing with often learners who are very poorly prepared for the programs that they're enrolling them in. And they often have very limited capacity. And instead of really thinking about building that capacity in our public providers as well as in other providers, maybe particular providers that work in particular industries. Our model is very much this kind of procurement-oriented one where they have to come and apply for grants through quite rigid and quite bureaucratic procedures in many cases. I'm nearly finished, Vera, I promise. So I think one of the key insights from South Africa is the assumption that a weak state can easily create new structures. The assumption that when you create new structures, in a condition in which you've got very low levels of trust. So we have very adversarial industrial relations, for example. We have very fragmented labor unions in some sectors, where labor unions have been quite weakened in recent decades. Suddenly, because you set up this institution in which everyone is going to play nicely together, there's almost this assumption that it'll happen because you've set up the institution in which it's supposed to happen, without really thinking about how do we build trust? How do we build more coordination amongst employers? How do we get employers and workers to talk about skills issues? How do we get employers to talk to education providers? That's the real hard part, not just setting up institutions and saying, off you go and do this. This is how this is, and report to us and tell us how you're doing it. I think it's a very, very difficult issue. And so the question that we are really grappling with in South Africa at the moment, because these structures are very much in the spotlight. I was just chatting to Maxim at the beginning of the seminar. There's a huge political debate right now in South Africa as we speak. There's a business lobby that wants to get rid of these structures. There's a lobby from the Treasury that wants to reallocate the funding levy. From the presidency has got other ideas. The Minister of Higher Education and Training and the CETAs themselves have got other ideas, industry associations. So there's a big debate happening. And our research is trying to feed into that. And one of the things that I think I would say all of us need to reflect on is, how do you craft organizations that actually really help education providers to engage with industry? And I don't think there can be a one-size-fits-all answer to it. I think a highly concentrated sector, a highly monopolized sector will have different needs to a very fragmented sector. A sector in which occupations are more organized and more coherent and more regulated will have different needs. Sectors in which there are strong industry associations will have different needs, and so on. So those are some of the things that we're grappling with, and I think, we're happy to share more insights on all of that. But I think that what most of us in most countries around the world need to really, this story that I've told is not a South African story alone. There's a lot of minutiae and detail that are very particular to South Africa, and particular things that we maybe did wrongly, maybe we made overly complicated, etc. But the broad brush strokes of the story you can see in many countries. Competence-based qualifications models, sector skills bodies are going to magically make TVET industry-led. And when you ask anyone who's involved in trying to set them up in country after country, they'll tell you, so far the employers are not really that interested, but we're trying to get them interested. And yet these structures are supposed to be the structures in which industry leads. So for me, the takeaway lessons are, it might sound kind of trite and obvious, but you can't design institutions for employer engagement and assume that those institutions will be able to do employer engagement if you don't already have engaged, collectively organized, interested employers. You actually, I'm not saying you don't need institutions, I think you do. I think you need some kind of sectoral bodies, but you have to take seriously that the job of those sectoral bodies is not to go in and say, right, industry, tell us what you need. Industry isn't going to do that. So we have to think through much more seriously, how do you do employer engagement when employers are not interested in being engaged? how do you develop vocational qualifications when most of the jobs that people are being hired for are not organized occupations that have any kind of formal body of knowledge associated with them? And how do you build institutions how do you actually not just wait for people to apply for money, but actually build the institutions that you want to have to be offering vocational education in your country? And for me, those questions are the questions that should be really driving us when we're thinking about these questions. So I was only 5 minutes over time, Vera. That's just my research center, the Center for Researching Education and Labor at Wits University. And sorry, that was a lot, but I was trying to explain different points at the same time.